Tom has a distinguished research career in biosciences, infectious diseases, and immunology, and it's been matched by an equally distinguished career in shaping research policy and managing global partnerships. Since his appointment as the Science for Africa Foundation's Chief Executive Officer in 2022, Tom continues to help shape the agenda for science and research across the continent. Can I just ask you about open research more specifically, and perhaps some of the kind of principles, if you like, that underpin open research, from data sharing and transparency, open peer review, and so. To what extent do you see these principles being adopted and even embedded across Africa?
Yeah, I think that's a very good conversation that we have been part of that conversation. And one of the reasons, for example, where we have been working with F1000 is because we wanted to have an open publishing house and our platform that can actually then support open science and open research and open publishing. It's about accessibility. It is about whatever data is generated, how quickly can it be driven into evidence? How can it be transitioned all the way to informing decision making? One of the challenges we have had with the policymakers, and I don't know whether it is specific for Africa or whether it is a global challenge, is it is always a difficult conversation with policymakers unless it is presented in a very different way, as opposed to how scientists sometimes put together their articles for purposes of just getting recognition or getting promoted within their own institutions. So what we would want is to make sure that as much information using the open accessibility, open availability, moving away from having all these data behind walls where it cannot be accessible. We are a very big appreciator of that approach. What we do is when we then put out awards for a grant that we are providing, we make that very clear to the grantees that the expectation is that you will share your data, you will publish as much as possible to open research that you have achieved, and that this data could be available eventually as packaged as evidence that will be really informing decision making. I know, for example, Marincola could address more about the pathways of how we get even quicker to build open science in Africa and globally. I know there are conversations even globally where there have been all kinds of discussions about how quickly is it available.
Why does open research matter so much, the development of science in Africa? I'm particularly interested in the impact that science can have in Africa itself.
I think for me, it is going back to something I said. The connection between science and society is very important. And unfortunately, in many countries, scientists are still viewed as people who work in their ivory towers, and they don't connect with the rest of society. And one way is to make sure that in the context of something like COVID, how do you deal with conspiracy theories all over the place? There's a reason why we still did not get beyond maybe 50% of vaccination in Africa. And part of that was a lot of misinformation. And there are people who are more dependent on social platforms to get their information rather than being dependent on well-researched data and evidence. And unfortunately, this is not confined to just the lay public. goes all the way to the leadership, unfortunately. And if the leaders themselves are making decisions driven by conspiracies, theories, then we are in trouble. And this is part of the example of where I find why it is so important to have open research and its accessibility available to the policymakers as much as possible. Of course, I have challenged many countries who are beginning to appreciate this in the context of COVID, although many policymakers cannot still pronounce what messenger RNA is as a vaccine. But the challenge to them is, do you have an office where you can establish, it could be an independent office, which then receives, collates, and provide you as policymakers with something that actually then informs your decision making. Now, we are quite away from that, Martin, in terms of having those kind of offices established, but those offices could be the key drivers of open research and open science, in my view, to create awareness and the connection between society and science.
Just picking up on that issue of society and specifically the challenges that Africa faces, and I'm just wondering if you could give me an example of one or two challenges that are very pressing at the moment, where you think that open research and science can really help to unlock those ones. Where do you think it can make the biggest difference, if you like?
I think that, let me say, there are three areas that are really, really big challenges currently for Africa. And we're trying to work through this as thematic areas because addressing them is urgent for all of us. So health remains a major issue for Africa. If you look at all the data for infectious diseases, 25% of the burden of infectious diseases is still in Africa. And you can name all of them. Malaria remains a major problem for Africa. When you're looking at the numbers that are generated, for example, by the World Health Organization, still 400,000 people die from malaria, despite a century or so of focusing on this. There are huge numbers of people who are infected or getting infected with HIV, despite the advances that have been made by the treatment available. That has been great in terms of extending lifespans. However, there's still no vaccine for HIV that we can say with confidence that we are near anywhere that. The same with TB, an age-old problem that keeps recurring across the continent. And then you can add those to a whole list of neglected tropical diseases as defined by the World Health Organization. There, I think I lost track of the number. There were 17, there could be 20. These are some of these diseases as old as the pyramids. When you look at, the mummies, people who actually try to look at, oh, what killed this one or this other one, and they are that old. Then, of course, we have a silent pandemic. Well, let me call it an epidemic rather than a pandemic, but there is a very silent epidemic of non-communicable diseases. Cancer, cardiovascular diseases are here now. Neuroscience challenges of strokes and everything else related to that. One of the challenges we have there is that, again, government has been very slow to create areas like how do we quickly screen people? How do we create awareness of the connection between these diseases with lifestyle or with diet. And my frustration, for example, the lack of awareness that actually, if you have big cities that are emerging across the continent that are becoming more and more polluted, that is trouble, particularly with regard to how pollution is linked to non-communicable diseases. Now, and of course, you could say the same thing about the connection between diabetes and diet, all of that. That's one area. The other area is, of course, the climate emergency we are in. I mean, you just have to look at the Horn of Africa. More than 43,000 people have died in Somalia. 5 or 6 consecutive failure of rain. I don't think in my own lifetime I have seen a scenario where you have people dying, you have all their livestock dying, and you have wildlife dying. I mean, if you see a zebra dead or giraffes are dying, then really, I don't think we have seen that. You know, these are supposed to be some of the species that are very resilient, but I think all of that has been lost by biodiversity, broadly speaking. That's an area which is an emergency. I have to say there, the governments have a huge appreciation of how this climate emergency, but of course they need to think more about the mitigations, the adaptation, and the resilience to the communities. And then the third area is, of course, food insecurity. We still very much countries that are dependent on the seasonal rains, not enough investment or a lack of sufficient funding to invest in huge irrigation, farming, and yet economies are being driven by agriculture. There's millions of people, tens of millions of people who are now going through complete lack of food or malnutrition with children, and not enough support even globally to support this. So, in defining our own strategy for the next 5 years, those are the 3 thematic areas: health, climate, and food.
These are 3 vast, complex problems. What role do you think that partners should play in this, and specifically publishing partners like F1000?
I think there are many organizations and institutions, and including scientists, who no longer see impact factors as the way research outputs should be reviewed. That has been accepted and is available somewhere, or just a conversation that actually addresses the urgency and the emergency that we are all dealing with. And institutions themselves are being challenged to look at how they approach, publishing in places like the F1000 platforms. The other aspect is, once you have gateways like the ones that F1000 has created through this Aura, platform itself that we have discussed and partnered with F1000, then institutions themselves are more amenable, very quick to then say, we are very happy to have a gateway ourselves to put our own output there. And then, because it brings all kinds of scientific articles and any other outputs, not just even from researchers, from research administrators, from the leadership, then I think they see this as a very positive development for themselves. So there are a number of organizations in Africa and universities and institutes that I think have approached F1000 for those gateways. Our role is to actually continue to create that awareness, to say there is a better way now. There are things that have been done over 100 years. Maybe it is time for us to look at how it works better, without necessarily say that, we are not saying that, the old systems do not work. They work. I mean, that is exactly where we all have been. But I think it is to emphasize that there is complementarity between all these approaches, and publishing houses should be able to do all of this so that all of us can actually have the options, even as we engage with leaders and scientific scientists in Africa.
Thank you so much. I just had one last question, if I could. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but bringing the focus back to Science for Africa Foundation, you've got a very long to-do list, I'm sure. Right at the top of that, where's the area you're most focused? What's the thing, if you like, you would most like to achieve?
One of the lessons that we have learned in Africa is that it's very important to focus on building organizations that have a very good level of sustainability, because the challenges that we have discussed, Martin, are not going to be solved in next 2 years or next 5 years or the next 10 years. Some of our global partners have been around for 100 years. We are very heavily supported, for example, by the Wellcome Trust in London. I know they have been around for all these years. So maybe our vision is also to start moving in that direction of making sure that we are not just here today and tomorrow. We go through an evolution process, but hopefully we can get to sustainability, because the challenges we have in Africa will be with us for some time. Everything from health, from climate, from food, this is going to be a long-term vision that must be part of our thinking. When I look where we invest mostly is in the area of health. So 70% of the funding that we put out goes to health research, and for good reasons, as I articulated to you, because that's where we have a huge burden of diseases. And this is a continent that is very much driven by young people. If you ask them what are their challenges, they will say they need only 3 things: decent education, they need good health, and they need opportunities, and they will do the rest. They will pursue their livelihoods, they will support their own families, they will create innovations. Those are the only things that they look for. So if I can end up in my term as the director and also being the person who've been involved in the creation of the ISA platform and now translating into SFA Foundation. I think what warms my heart always is to engage with these young people who are now positioning themselves as emerging leaders in their own right. I mean, that is very, very warming. And I also look at the quality and the quantity of science that is coming out of the networks that we have supported across the continent. There are at least 3,000 scientists that are directly or indirectly involved with us across the continent, and our footprint is everywhere. So I think that is very, very warming. Just to give you one example, in March, we announced one of our largest flagship programs here in Nairobi, and it is called the Deltas, Developing Excellence in Training and Sciences in Africa. A huge event for us. And the most important thing is that there are now 14 networks that we are going to be working with them, managing and oversighting them for the next 5 years. Within those networks, they are cross-cutting across all those disease areas that I mentioned to you. And more importantly, the footprint is in 36 countries. And so that is very, very important for us to see how north, south, eastern, western, central how we are trying to uplift institutions and research institutes there so that they can do a better job in future by building their own people and by building the infrastructure.